Hello, dear listener. This week we have 5 short, scary stories ready for you. So, gather round, come close, and listen. Story number 1. Who's in my bed? A father went to say goodnight to his 7-year-old son, very well knowing that if he didn't, his son would have trouble sleeping. It had become a nightly routine between them. He entered the dimly lit room where his son waited under his blanket. With a first glance, the father could tell that there was something unusual about his son tonight, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He looked the same, yet had a grin that drew from ear to ear. "You okay, buddy?" the father asked. The son nodded, still with the grin, before saying, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." The father chuckled a bit before getting on his hands and knees to check, only to satisfy his son. There, under the bed, pale and afraid, was his son. His son whispered, "Daddy, there's someone on my bed." Story number 2. The Cabin. A hiker decided to go on a hike by himself, something he was not very used to. The whole day was normal. Trees and bushes engulfed his surroundings. He enjoyed being outdoors in the mountains. Nothing seemed strange to him. Well, that was until he started making his way back to his car. He figured an 8-hour hike was good enough. However, the sky was already getting dark, and he needed to get back fast. What was odd was how much he didn't recognize the trail back. He began to panic. Night had already taken over, and all he had was a flashlight and no clue on how to get back. He knew it was already too late and too dangerous to keep pushing through this perilous forest. He began to worry that he would have no shelter for the night. Luckily enough, he stumbled across a broken down cabin. It was dark and seemed like no one had visited it in years, but he knew it was the only place he could rest until daylight, especially since his flashlight was running out of battery. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. So he let himself in. Inside, there was one bed, just big enough for one person to fit. He knew if the owner came back, he could explain himself. He was sure that the owner wouldn't mind, or was probably never coming back. So he went ahead and got himself comfortable in bed. As he tried to sleep, he couldn't ignore the collection of paintings around the room. Portraits of strange-looking people, all peering at him, each wearing a smile that sent chills up his spine. But eventually, his exhaustion from the hike got the best of him, and he was able to drift off to a restless sleep and ignore the smiling faces. The next morning, he got up early and was shocked to see that there were no paintings in the room. No, no paintings at all. Instead, there were open windows. Story number 3. The Red Wristband. A doctor was working at a hospital where patients were tagged with colored bands. Green meant alive, and red meant deceased. One night, the doctor was instructed to get a few supplies from the basement of the hospital, and so he headed to the elevator. The elevator doors opened, and there was a patient inside, minding her own business. Now, patients were allowed to roam around the hospital to stretch, especially those who have stayed long periods. But the rule was they had to be back in their rooms before 10 o'clock. The doctor smiled at the patient before pressing the button that would take him to the basement. He found it unusual that the woman didn't already have a button pressed. He wondered if she was heading to the basement too. The lift finally reached the floor where the doors opened. In the distance was a man, limping, shuffling towards the elevator. And in a panic, the doctor slammed the closed door button over and over again. Thankfully, it finally closed, and the elevator began to ascend back up, the doctor's heart pounding. "Why did you do that? He was just trying to use the elevator," the woman stated. Did you see his wrist?" the doctor asked. "It was red. He died last night. I would know this because I was in the room when he did." The woman paused and then flashed a toothy grin, then slowly raised her wrist. All the doctor saw was red. Story number 4. White with Ren. A man just moved into an apartment and headed to the receptionist to get his keys. The receptionist gave him the key with a smile, but warned him not to disturb the door with no number on his floor. He wondered why, but didn't bother to ask. He was too busy with his new apartment to really care. After he finished unpacking, he did begin to get curious. He questioned why the receptionist would warn him of such things, and so he stepped out of his apartment to check the door with no number. He knocked on the door at first, but there was no answer. After a moment, he then tried the doorknob, but found it was locked. So instead, he got onto his knees and peeked through the keyhole. The apartment, from what he could see, appeared to be empty. His eyes scanned the whole place, as well as he could, before stopping at a woman who was standing face against the wall in the corner. He noticed her pale skin and long black hair before stepping back, suddenly feeling as if he had been interrupting, watching. Feeling, well, wrong for invading someone else's privacy. He brushed it off, assuming she was someone that did not want to be disturbed. The next day, he got curious again about this woman and eventually went back. Straight away, getting onto his knees, he peeked through the keyhole, but all he saw was red. He assumed that the pale woman must have caught him peeking the last time and covered the hole with something red. He left the door alone and instead went down to the receptionist to ask her a few questions. The receptionist sighed and asked, "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" He admitted to it, and so she began to tell him the story. She told him that a couple used to live in that apartment a long time ago, but the husband went mad and murdered his wife. However, this couple was unique, as they both had pale skin, black hair, and red eyes. Story number 5. A Mother's Call. A daughter was in her room upstairs, doing her homework, when suddenly she heard her mother call to come down for dinner. She jumped onto her feet and began to make her way toward the stairs. But before she took a step on the first stair, a pair of hands grabbed her and pulled her into the laundry room beside the staircase. She panicked, struggled, fought, before realizing that it was her mother. Eyes watery and bloodshot, her mother said, "Don't go down there, honey. I heard it too." Well, dear listener, I hope you enjoyed this small anthology of stories. Perhaps I will release a few more next week, but next Friday we will be ending this spooky October with one of my favorite stories of all time. A dramatic reading of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Until then, sleep well, my dear